Snow drifted across Cottonwood Ridge the way old memories drift through a lonely mind, quiet and pale and unwilling to let go. Winter had tightened its grip around the land, turning every fence post into a frozen monument and every breath into a ghost rising toward the colorless sky. Lydia Rosefield moved through that silence as if she were part of it. A slender woman of 26 with a life shaped by harsh seasons and gentler dreams, she no longer dared to speak aloud. Her cabin stood alone against the wind, its roof patched by her own tired hands, its chimney coughing thin smoke into the dusk. She split wood with deliberate care, each strike steady, as though rhythm could be reason enough to stay whole. Her hair, long and dark as river stones, slipped over her shoulder when she leaned to gather the pieces. She paused once, pressing a hand to her lower back, and listened to the haunting quiet that stretched across the valley. No wagon wheels. No cattle calls. No human voice except her own when she prayed into the emptiness. Solitude was not something she had chosen, but over the years it had grown around her like second skin. 3 winters had passed since she buried the husband who had loved her gently and died too soon, and the world had grown smaller ever since. Folks in town pitied her, or feared her bad luck, or simply forgot she existed. Most days she preferred the forgetting. She carried the wood inside, nudging the door closed with her foot. Warmth greeted her in a faint, flickering way. She fed the hearth and watched the flames stretch upward, their glow kissing the worn quilts and pine floorboards. This was her kingdom, quiet, predictable, aching. She brewed tea from the last of her dried mint and curled onto the small bench beneath the window, tracing the frost gathering along the glass. Soft flakes twirled downward outside, catching the dimming light like tiny falling stars. The season would be a hard one. She felt it in her bones, in the heaviness that had followed her from summer into this deepening cold. Evening came quicker than she wished. Lydia lit a lantern and tightened the shutters, securing them against the rising wind. She checked the rifle propped beside the door, not out of fear but routine. Wolves roamed closer now that the snows were thickening, and isolation made every sound echo larger than life. She sat near the fire with her mending basket, stitching a tear in her wool skirt. The needle slipped through the fabric in clean, practiced motions, her breath steady though her mind wandered places she rarely visited. She remembered laughter in this room. She remembered another pair of boots by the door. She remembered the warmth of belonging. The remembering hurt, yet she clung to it for the simple reason that forgetting felt worse. The hour was quiet, too quiet, when an unexpected knock thudded against the door. Lydia's head lifted sharply. No one came this far west unless necessity drove them, and certainly not after sundown in the heart of winter. Her heartbeat flickered in her chest like a candle caught in a draught. She rose slowly, brushing her hands against her skirt. Another knock sounded, firm, heavy, unmistakably human. She took a careful step toward the door, then another, until her fingers hovered above the latch. For a long breath, she hesitated. The loneliness that had lived inside her urged caution, whispering that trouble often traveled in groups, and misfortune wore many faces. Yet something deeper, something softer, urged her forward. An instinct born not of recklessness, but of the quiet compassion that had never left her, even in grief. She unlatched the door. Wind rushed in first, cold enough to sting her skin, but it wasn't the wind that stole her breath. 5 silhouettes stood before her, tall and silent against the swirling snow. 4 were broad-shouldered men with hair bound in winter braids, their chests bare beneath heavy blankets thrown over powerful frames. Even in the half-light, she could see they were Apache, striking, solemn, carrying the weary stillness of travelers who had come far. The 5th was an elderly man leaning on a carved staff, his long silver hair dancing wildly in the storm, his eyes bright with something ancient and kind. The tallest of the younger men stepped forward, his voice deep yet gentle enough to settle the air around them. "We seek shelter for one night. Only that." His words carried respect rather than demand, and though the winds pressed hard against them, none of the 5 moved in a threatening way. Snow clung to their skin. Their breath rose in cold clouds. Exhaustion drew lines across their features. Lydia's hand tightened around the doorframe. She didn't answer immediately. Uncertainty gnawed at her, sharp as winter teeth. She had heard stories in town, tales twisted by fear and ignorance, but she'd also heard whispers of the Apache elders who walked with more honor than most men dared claim. The old father's gaze met hers, not pleading, not demanding, only steady, like the gaze of someone who understood grief when they saw it. A different kind of silence fell, the kind that waits to see who a person truly is. Lydia felt her loneliness settle beside her like a familiar companion, urging her to open herself just a little. Something in the way the old man's shoulders sagged beneath the storm tugged at her heart. She stepped back without a word, widening the doorway. Warmth from the hearth spilled out, beckoning them gently inside. One by one, the men entered, their massive forms softening in the glow of firelight. The cabin shrank around them, but the air grew fuller, richer, as though 5 beating hearts had revived something dormant in its walls. The old father lowered himself near the fire with a soft sigh of gratitude, his hands opened toward the flames. The tallest of the younger men paused, meeting Lydia's eyes with a nod both respectful and grateful. She closed the door behind them, shutting out the storm. For the first time in years, the silence inside her cabin was not empty. And as the wind howled against the shutters, Lydia felt a subtle change stir in her chest, a shift as faint as the first crack of thaw beneath deep snow, without yet knowing that this night born of winter would lead her straight into a story her heart had never imagined. Morning arrived shyly, its pale light slipping across Lydia's floorboards like a timid guest unsure if it was welcome. She stirred slowly beneath her quilt, listening first, the way one listens after years of living alone. Careful, cautious, heart poised for either peace or warning. But all she heard was the soft crackle of firewood, and the gentle murmur of low voices. For a moment she wondered if she had dreamt the night's arrival of those 5 strangers, if her loneliness had shaped an illusion of company. Yet when she rose and peered toward the hearth, the truth blossomed like warmth in her chest. The 4 younger men were already awake, moving around her home with quiet purpose. Taza, the tall one with eyes like twilight, was stacking split logs beside the fire. Koana knelt by her broken chair, running his hand along a fractured leg as though listening to what the wood wanted. Nantan sharpened her dull hatchet with slow rhythmic strokes, and Yiska hauled snowmelt water from the barrel outside, steam rising from his shoulders in the icy air. They worked without being asked, without announcement, as though respect was a natural language between them. Their father, Kaso, remained seated on a woven blanket near the fire, his aged hands open toward the heat. He greeted Lydia with a nod that held more gratitude than words could express. She returned the gesture, feeling a soft tug within her ribs, as if benevolence had been waiting too long for a chance to stretch its legs. She busied herself with preparing breakfast, though her hands trembled slightly. It had been years since she cooked for a table full of others, and the act stirred memories of laughter that once filled these walls. She shook them away gently, letting the past settle like snow while she cracked eggs, warmed skillet bread, and simmered coffee strong enough to chase away winter's ache. The scent filled the cabin, and something like comfort expanded inside her. The men did not hover or intrude. They allowed her space, but their presence filled the room with a steady warmth. When she set the food out, they waited for her nod before taking their seats. They ate with quiet reverence, as if every bite mattered. Lydia watched them through lowered lashes, noticing the small things. The way Koana paused to savor the steam rising from his cup, how Yiska smiled softly at the taste of warm bread, how Nantan closed his eyes briefly in thanks. Taza barely spoke, yet every movement of his seemed deliberate, measured, as though he carried unspoken stories on his broad shoulders. It was Kaso who finally broke the silence, his voice deep and wind-worn. "Kindness is a fire," he murmured. "It burns brighter when shared." Lydia swallowed around a sudden tightness in her throat. She had forgotten what it felt like to have wisdom spoken into her home. After breakfast, the men offered to continue helping with chores. Lydia tried to protest, but Taza's steady gaze held a quiet insistence, one that did not command but reassured. She relented. They worked outside while she tidied the cabin, yet she found herself drifting toward the window repeatedly, watching them through the frost-kissed glass. Snowflakes clung to their braids. Their breath rose in soft plumes. The rhythm of their labor created a strange, peaceful harmony with the winter around them. The stillness fractured when Sheriff Boone rode up the ridge, his horse snorting clouds into the frigid air. his silhouette cut sharply against the muted horizon. Lydia stepped outside as he dismounted, pulling her shawl tighter. The sheriff's eyes narrowed at the sight of the men, lingering too long on the weapons strapped to their sides. "Thought you were alone out here, Lydia," he said in a tone meant to sound casual, but carried the weight of suspicion. She straightened her spine. "They're travelers caught in the storm," she replied. "Nothing more." Boone's gaze flicked toward Rowan, the deputy riding behind him. Rowan stared at the Apache men with a sneer that made the air colder. "Dangerous weather to be taking in strangers," the deputy muttered. Taza stepped forward, not aggressively, simply present. "We seek shelter and peace, nothing else." Boone hesitated, caught between caution and decency. Lydia could see the conflict play across his features. Finally he tipped his hat. "Storm's meant to worsen tonight," he warned. "Keep your doors secured." When they rode off, Rowan cast one last look over his shoulder. A look that promised trouble brewing somewhere beyond the horizon. Lydia felt it settle inside her, a bitter seed waiting for the right moment to sprout. The day stretched on. Taza climbed onto the roof to mend a leak she had learned to ignore, while Koana replaced the broken chair leg with a piece he carved by hand. Yiska tended the animals, and Nantan checked the fences before dusk swallowed the ridge. Lydia found herself moving among them more comfortably. The cabin no longer felt like a shrine of memories but a living place, touched by hands that meant no harm. As evening returned, she prepared stew and cornbread. The fire glowed deeper, casting gold along the men's faces. Casso told quiet stories of rivers, mountains, and the spirits that walked with him through long years. Lydia listened, captivated by the softness of his tone, the reverence in his words. It had been so long since her home held stories other than her own sorrow. After supper, the men arranged their blankets near the hearth. Lydia lingered by the table, watching shadows dance across the ceiling. She noticed Taza glance her way once, a question in his eyes, though he didn't voice it. Something unspoken passed between them. An understanding neither could name yet, but both felt in the quiet spaces. The fire dimmed to embers. The room grew still save for the whisper of wind outside. Lydia moved toward her bedroom door, pausing as Casso's voice reached her. "You carry a winter inside, child. Do not let it freeze you beyond thaw." She exhaled, feeling the weight of truth in his words. Her fingers brushed the doorframe, searching for steadiness. She turned slightly, meeting the old man's gaze. Before she could answer, a sudden thud sounded against the distant shutters, soft but deliberate, as though something or someone brushed past the cabin walls. The fire crackled sharply, sending sparks upward. Taza rose halfway, muscles tensing as he listened to the dark beyond the logs. And Lydia, heart tightening, realized winter was not the only thing pressing against her home tonight. The sound against the shutter faded into the night, leaving a stillness that felt too sharp to be trusted. Taza remained half-risen, listening with every part of himself, while the others shifted their weight quietly, ready if the darkness demanded it. Lydia stood frozen near her doorway, her breath thin, her pulse echoing louder than the whispering wind outside. After a long, taut silence, Taza eased back onto his blanket, though his eyes stayed fixed on the window, as if the snow itself had spoken something only he could hear. Morning came reluctantly, draping the world in a veil of gray. Lydia woke with the echo of last night's questions still pressed against her mind. She stepped into the main room to find the men already awake. Yiska had opened the front door to sweep away the snow piled high against it, letting a slice of icy air slip inside. Taza stood near the threshold, scanning the ridge with a gaze sharpened by instinct. Lydia followed his line of sight and saw fresh tracks, boots, not paws, leading from the tree line to the side of her cabin and back again. Her throat tightened. Someone had been watching in the dark. Nantan crouched beside the tracks, running 2 fingers along the imprint. "A man's boot," he murmured. "Heavy step." He rose slowly, his expression darkening like the sky before a storm. Lydia wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, though the cold she felt had nothing to do with winter. She thought of Rowan's sneer the day before, the suspicious narrowing of his eyes. Fear began stitching itself between her ribs, thread by tight thread. Inside, the fire crackled back to life, and the scent of warm broth filled the room. Lydia cooked in a daze, her movements practiced but absent. The men ate in thoughtful silence, each aware of the tension hanging above them like a low-hung branch waiting to break. Only when they finished did Koana speak, gentle as snowfall. "Fear follows those who have lost too much," he said, eyes soft on her. "But fear can be walked beside, not surrendered to." Lydia nodded, though her breath wavered. She had lived years believing danger passed her by simply because she was alone. Now that her home held company, danger seemed eager to return. The men spent the day strengthening what winter and neglect had worn thin. Yiska hammered new stakes into the fence line, his movements swift but careful. Nantan dug out the snow around the wagon shed, assessing its sagging roof with a practiced eye. Koana tended to the cabin door, smoothing down the rough wood so it would close cleanly against the cold. Lydia watched them from the window, her heart stretching in quiet, unsteady gratitude. She hadn't known how empty her days had become until she saw them filled with gentle labor and the simple grace of shared effort. Taza worked closest to her. He repaired the smokehouse roof, cleared the fallen branches, and split a stack of wood twice the size of her own. Even from a distance she felt the gravity of him. Calm, silent, self-contained, like a mountain that knew its place in the world. Yet every now and then he glanced at her window, and when their eyes met, something warm flickered between them, brief but undeniable. As the sun dipped low, painting the snow in muted lavender, Lydia ventured outside with steaming cups of coffee. Her hands trembled only slightly as she offered one to Taza. He accepted with a nod, their fingers brushing the way two sparks might touch before the fire catches. He did not speak, but his eyes held hers with a depth that softened the winter air around them. It was Nantan who spoke of the tracks again. He believed Rowan had circled the cabin to provoke fear, or gather proof for some imagined wrongdoing. Lydia felt a tremor beneath her ribs. Rowan's hunger for confrontation was a truth everyone in town knew but few addressed. She wondered what story he planned to tell, how he intended to twist the sight of her offering shelter to men who had shown her nothing but respect. The men reassured her, though no one pretended danger wasn't tightening its hold. Taza's voice was steady when he spoke. "If you wish us to leave before trouble grows, we will go." The words were simple, but beneath them lived a promise of honor. Lydia felt the weight of choice settle heavily in her chest. She shook her head. "I don't want this home empty again," she whispered. Silence followed, not empty but full of acknowledgement, full of the first fragile threads of connection weaving between them. Taza's expression shifted, a subtle softening around the eyes, as though her admission had opened a door he had been waiting near without expectation. As twilight spread across the ridge, Lydia and the men shared the evening meal. Conversation grew easier, like snow melting beneath warm hands. Koana taught her how to braid winter herbs into small charms meant to ward off ill intent. Nantan carved a tiny wooden bird and placed it in her palm, its wings curved as though ready to take flight. Yiska told a brief, quiet story about the first time he saw a wolf look him in the eye and turn away instead of attacking. Lydia listened, feeling the cabin deepen into a haven rather than a shelter. But the day's ease carried a thin fault line. As she stepped outside to fetch more firewood, Lydia glimpsed the distant glow of lanterns moving along the ridge. 3, maybe 4, too far to identify, but close enough to twist the calm inside her stomach. She held her breath until the lights vanished behind the trees. Later, when the men settled on their blankets and the logs in the hearth softened into embers, Lydia lingered near the dying fire. She felt Taza watching her from where he rested, not intruding, simply present. Their eyes met, and in the quiet flicker of the flames, she sensed a question neither dared voice. How long would the world allow this fragile peace to last? A sudden, distant crack echoed across the ridge. Not the gentle snap of ice shifting, but the sharp report of a rifle fired into the cold. Lydia's heart jumped, and she turned toward the window instinctively. The snow outside shimmered under the moonlight, calm and untouched, yet the sound lingered like a warning carried on the wind. Taza sat up slowly, his gaze darkening with understanding. Someone was not merely watching now. Someone was preparing to step out of the shadows. The storm announced itself with a low moan across the plains, a sound so deep it seemed to rise from the bones of the earth rather than the sky. Lydia felt it before she heard it, an unease settling over her like the shadow of a passing hawk. The air inside the cabin tasted different, sharp, metallic, as though the wind carried distant warnings in its throat. By dusk, the first gust slammed against the shutters, rattling them in their frames. Snow swirled past the windows in frantic spirals, and the world outside vanished into a hollow white silence that struck straight at the heart. Yiska secured the last of the firewood against the wall, while Koanna strengthened the door latch with a wooden bar he shaped minutes earlier. Nantan checked the chimney, ensuring the smoke would keep its path clear when the winds grew harsher. Taza stood near the window, watching the storm assemble like a gathering of restless spirits. Lydia stood beside him, their shoulders almost touching though neither acknowledged the closeness. Lightning flickered faintly inside the storm clouds, revealing for an instant a wall of swirling white that stretched endlessly toward the ridge. "It's rolling fast," Taza murmured, his voice low, swallowed quickly by the wind. Lydia nodded, unable to tear her gaze away from the storm's vastness. She had seen many winters, many storms, but something about this one felt different, as though it carried intentions beyond cold and fury. The men moved inside with purposeful quiet, their calm steadiness grounding her nerves in ways she could not explain. Kaso sat on a woven blanket near the hearth, his knees bent, his hands resting lightly on his staff. His eyes were half closed, not in fear, but in listening. "Storms carry truths," he said softly. "They shake loose what we try too hard to hold still." Lydia felt her throat tighten. She did not ask what he meant. Some words were meant to be absorbed slowly, like warmth from a dying fire. Night fell abruptly, swallowing the cabin in thick darkness until Taza lit 2 lanterns and placed them carefully near the walls. Shadows jumped along the ceiling, bending and stretching as the fire crackled. The wind howled louder, pushing against the wood as though trying to tear its way inside. A few flakes drifted through the smallest cracks, melting instantly on the warm floorboards. Lydia sat near the window, wrapped in a wool blanket, listening to the roof groan. Fear pricked at her, a familiar sensation she had often carried alone. But tonight, she was not alone. And that unfamiliar truth unsettled her almost as much as the storm itself. The men spoke in low tones, planning for any danger the night might bring. Fallen trees, drifting snow, weakened beams. Taza's voice remained steady, anchoring the room with quiet authority. When the first true blast of the storm struck, the entire cabin shuddered. Lydia startled, her breath catching as the shutters banged hard enough to splinter. Yiska rushed to reinforce them while Taza knelt beside her, his hand hovering near her shoulder, offering steadiness without assuming it. "Are you frightened?" he asked gently. She swallowed hard. "Only of the memories," she whispered. "The storm outside I can weather. It's the ones inside I can't predict." Taza nodded, understanding something unspoken in her voice. "Storms inside break hardest," he murmured. The wind escalated, screaming through the trees. Loose snow slammed against the cabin like handfuls of gravel. Lydia pressed her palm over her heart, feeling its unsteady rhythm, then closed her eyes as a memory surged bright and painful. The winter her husband died, the last storm she endured alone, the echo of his labored breathing, the moment the fire dimmed and she realized she had no one left to hold. A soft cry escaped her, unbidden. She turned her face away, ashamed of its fragility, but Kaso's gentle voice drifted across the room like a lullaby. "Grief is the shadow of love, child. It does not exist without the warmth it once knew." Lydia's eyes burned. She felt herself unraveling at the edges, undone by the simple truth of his words. Without speaking, Taza shifted closer, draping his heavy coat around her shoulders. The warmth enveloped her instantly, smelling of pine smoke and open sky. His hand brushed her arm, careful, as though touching something precious. Lydia held the coat tightly, surprised by how safe she felt wrapped inside it. Her breath steadied. The storm outside raged harder, yet inside, she found a strange calm settling through her chest. Hours passed in stormlight and silence. The shutters groaned. The fire snapped. Snow piled heavy on the roof, weighing the world in thick white layers. The others drifted into rest, stretched across blankets, though their breaths remained shallow, ready. Only Lydia and Taza stayed awake near the fire, their silhouettes softened by amber glow and flickering shadows. The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable but full of something waiting to be named. Lydia watched the flames dance, each ember rising like a small, fiery wish. Taza sat still beside her, hands resting on his knees, eyes reflecting the firelight. She wondered what he carried in the quiet spaces of his spirit, what mountains he had crossed, what wounds he hid beneath the calm of his voice. A sudden loud crack startled them both, a tree limb snapping under the weight of snow and crashing somewhere near the back wall. The cabin trembled. Lydia gasped, instinctively reaching for Taza's arm. His hand closed around hers without hesitation, firm, strong, grounding. She felt the warmth of his palm wrap around her cold fingers, and a slow, aching breath left her chest. The storm pressed harder, rattling the windows like a trapped thing begging release. Lydia leaned closer, her temple brushing Taza's shoulder. He went still, breath catching in a way she almost didn't notice, then slowly exhaled as though accepting a truth he'd long held at bay. Her weight against him was small, feather-light, but it struck him like the softest kind of thunder. Outside, the blizzard swallowed the world whole. Inside, something else stirred. Tender, fragile, forming in the spaces between heartbeats. Lydia closed her eyes, letting exhaustion pull her toward a sleep she had not known in years. A sleep beside another heartbeat, safe within another's warmth. And as the wind roared its wildest cry, the roof groaned one final warning. An uneasy creak that told Taza dawn might bring more than fallen snow. It might bring consequences. It might bring danger. It might bring everything he had long feared to face. Dawn crept over Cottonwood Ridge like a shy visitor, brushing pale gold across the snow until it shimmered like a land freshly made. The storm had passed in the night, leaving a hush so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. Lydia stepped outside with a blanket around her shoulders, the cold kissing her lips, the air sharp with the purity that follows chaos. Behind her, the cabin still carried the warmth of shared bodies and flickering firelight, traces of the long night when fear and tenderness had entwined so closely she could hardly separate one from the other. She stood in the quiet, breathing in a new kind of stillness, one that no longer felt empty. Inside, the brothers stirred awake while Casso whispered to the fire, as though thanking the spirits for one more sunrise. Lydia watched their shadows move softly across the window, familiar now in a way that tugged at her chest. She had grown used to their presence without realizing it, as though her heart had been tilled for years waiting for warmth to plant itself in the soil. And yet even as she wrapped the blanket tighter, she sensed the world beyond the ridge stretching its fingers toward them. Rumors traveled faster than storms. Fear traveled faster still. The first crack of tension arrived on the wind, faint at first, then clearer, the crunch of hooves against hardened snow. Lydia's breath halted. She turned to see a line of riders moving up the slope, their silhouettes stark against the newborn light. Deputy Rowan led them, jaw tight, rifle slung across his chest. Behind him followed 3 ranch hands known for being loyal to coin more than law. The way they rode made her skin prickle. They had not come to talk. The cabin door opened behind her. Taza stepped out, tall and silent, the remnants of sleep still softening his features until he saw the riders. Then his expression hardened, not into anger but into a calm readiness, the kind of steady resolve forged by surviving harsher things than men with guns. The brothers followed, standing behind him with quiet unity, forming a wall beside Lydia though none spoke a word. Rowan halted his horse a few yards away, breath rising in harsh white plumes. He tilted his hat back and glared at Lydia with a mixture of accusation and triumph. "You've made your choice plain," he called. "Harboring them. Hiding them. Bringing danger to this ridge." Lydia stepped forward before she could talk herself out of it. Her voice trembled but held its shape. "They're not danger. They're travelers seeking shelter. Same as any decent soul would in winter." Rowan's laugh cracked through the cold. "Decent? You've let them crawl into your home like wolves. Folks in town are frightened. Boone might be too soft to act, but I'm not." Taza took one step forward, his presence filling the space between threat and defense. "We came with peace," he said, his deep voice carrying across the snow like a promise of steadiness. "We asked for one night and repaid every bit we used. There is no harm here." Rowan spit into the snow. "Harm is what you bring with you. Always has been. Always will be. Yiska bristled, but Nantan laid a hand on his arm, keeping him grounded. Koana watched Rowan with an expression both sad and wary, as though witnessing a story he had seen unfold too many times. The sun inched higher, gilding Taza's profile in warm gold. Lydia found herself moving closer to him, drawn by something she hadn't fully named until this very moment. Something that made her chest feel both fragile and unbreakable at once. Rowan noticed. His eyes narrowed. "There it is," he said sharply. "Her standing beside you like that." The words stung, but they did not shake her. Instead, they carved clarity. She lifted her chin. "I stand here because I choose to. Because they showed me more kindness in days than some have given me in years." A murmur rippled through Rowan's men. Rowan's jaw twitched, frustration simmering beneath his skin. Then he reached for his rifle. The world tensed. Before the metal could clear its strap, another voice cut through the chill. "That's enough, Rowan." Sheriff Boone rode up from the trail, face grim but deliberate. He dismounted, hand resting on his holster though he didn't draw. "I told you yesterday to leave this ridge alone." Rowan bristled, but Boone's tone sharpened. "Touch that rifle and you answer to me, not your own temper." For a long heartbeat, stillness held. Rowan's fingers hovered over the weapon, but something in Boone's stance, solid, immovable, froze him. With a tight curse he lowered his hand. "This ain't over," he muttered, then kicked his horse into a retreat. His riders followed, glancing back only once before disappearing over the ridge. Silence returned, deeper than before. Lydia released a breath she had been holding for what felt like an entire season. Her knees weakened, but before she could steady herself, Taza stepped beside her, his hand hovering near her arm. He didn't touch her at first, waiting for her to choose. When she leaned into him, he let his fingers settle gently, reverently, as if holding something fragile and fiercely precious. Inside the cabin, the fire sputtered softly. Casso watched them from the doorway, eyes glimmering with understanding older than any winter. Lydia felt Taza turn toward her fully, the blanket around her shoulders slipping slightly as he cupped her hands between his larger ones. His breath fogged softly between them. His voice dropped to a low whisper, vibrating through her chest more than her ears. "When I first stepped through your door," he began, "I felt something I had not known in many years. A warmth that was not from fire. A stillness that did not come from silence. I tried to ignore it. I failed. And last night when the storm raged and you leaned against me," his voice faltered raw, "I feared the truth more than the storm." Lydia's pulse thudded in her throat. She had waited so long for a feeling that did not hurt. Something inside her opened like the first crack of thaw beneath deep snow. Taza's hands trembled faintly as he continued. "I love you, Lydia." Softly. Quietly. Without demand. "But wholly. If you send me away, I will go. But my heart will stay here on this ridge." Her breath caught. Snowflakes drifted between them like blessing or omen. She raised her hand, touching the side of his face with a tenderness she had once thought lost forever. "I was afraid to feel anything again," she whispered. "But you made the world less cold." His eyes closed for a moment, as though steadying himself against the emotion in her voice. When he opened them, dawn's gold reflected in their depths. "Stay," she whispered. He leaned his forehead to hers, breath mingling with hers, the warmth between them blooming into something bright and unshakable. "Stay longer than one night." Behind them, the sun climbed over Cottonwood Ridge, spreading light across the snow like the beginning of a new story, as the world, finally, exhaled. And in that golden hush, Lydia knew winter had finally broken.